The gymnasium buzzed with nervous energy as competitors from across the country gathered for the National Combat Championships. Among the sea of athletes warming up, stretching, and mentally preparing for their matches, one figure stood out not for her size or intimidating presence, but for the quiet confidence that seemed to radiate from her small frame. Elena Rodriguez adjusted her fighting gloves one final time, her dark eyes scanning the crowded venue. At 5 feet 4 inches and barely 125 pounds, she looked almost fragile among the other fighters. Her long black hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and her plain training clothes gave no hint of the deadly skills that lay beneath her unassuming appearance. Across the gymnasium, a group of Navy SEALs had gathered to watch the competitions. They were off duty, enjoying a rare weekend of leisure, but their military bearing was unmistakable even in civilian clothes. Among them stood Marcus Thompson, a 6'2" tower of muscle and confidence. His broad shoulders and scarred knuckles told the story of countless hours of combat training and real-world missions. "Look at that crowd," Marcus said to his teammate Jake Williams, nodding toward the fighting mats. "Bunch of wannabes playing soldier. None of these people know what real combat looks like." Jake shifted uncomfortably. He had been Marcus's partner for 3 years and knew his friend's tendency toward arrogance, especially when it came to civilian martial artists. "Come on, man. Some of these fighters are pretty skilled. This is a national championship, not some local tournament." Marcus laughed, the sound carrying more condescension than humor. "Skilled at dancing around in a controlled environment with rules and referees. That's not fighting, that's performance art. When your life is actually on the line, when there's no bell to save you, that's when you find out who's really tough." The conversation might have continued, but it was interrupted by an announcement over the gymnasium's sound system. The next match was about to begin, and the competitors were called to the mat. Elena Rodriguez was among them, facing off against a much larger opponent who looked like he could bench press a small car. "Now this should be interesting," Marcus said, his attention drawn to the mismatched pair. "That little girl is about to get a reality check." The fight began, and what happened next silenced much of the crowd. Elena moved like water, flowing around her opponent's powerful strikes with an almost supernatural grace. Every attack he launched seemed to meet empty air, while her precise counters found their mark with surgical accuracy. Within 90 seconds, her opponent was on the ground, tapping out to a submission hold that had appeared from nowhere. The crowd erupted in applause, but Marcus remained unimpressed. "Lucky break," he muttered. "Her opponent was probably going easy on her because she's a woman. No way that would work against someone who's really trying to hurt her." Jake raised an eyebrow. "Dude, did we watch the same fight? She just dominated someone twice her size." In a sport competition with rules, Marcus emphasized, "It's completely different in real combat. Trust me, I know what I'm talking about." Elena's next 3 matches followed a similar pattern. Each opponent was larger, stronger, and more aggressive than the last, but none could touch her. She moved with a fluid precision that seemed to defy the laws of physics, turning her opponent's strength against them and finding openings that shouldn't have existed. By the time she reached the championship final, word had spread throughout the venue about the small woman who was dismantling much larger fighters with apparent ease. During a break between matches, Elena made her way to the water station near where the SEALs were sitting. She moved quietly, without the swagger that many fighters adopted after impressive victories. Her demeanor remained humble, almost apologetic, as if she was sorry for the attention her performances had drawn. Marcus saw an opportunity and couldn't resist. He approached her with the confident stride of someone accustomed to being the most dangerous person in any room. "Excuse me, miss. I've been watching your matches today. Pretty impressive against these sport fighters." Elena looked up at him, her dark eyes taking in his military bearing and obvious physical conditioning. "Thank you," she said simply, her voice soft and slightly accented. "I've been training for a long time." "I'm sure you have," Marcus said, his tone friendly but with an undertone that suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. "I'm Marcus Thompson, Navy SEAL. My team and I were just discussing the difference between sport fighting and real combat. What you're doing here is definitely skilled, but it's a very controlled environment.
Elena nodded politely. You're absolutely right. Competition fighting is very different from real situations.
The rules change everything. Her agreement seemed to encourage Marcus.
Exactly.
Out there, in the real world, there are no weight classes, no referees, no rules about what you can and can't do. It's about survival, pure and simple.
That's what we train for. That makes sense, Elena replied.
Your training must be very intense. 20 years of it, Marcus said proudly. Special operations, close quarters combat, survival training in environments that would break most people.
We learn to fight when we're exhausted, injured, outnumbered. That's the kind of experience that really matters. Elena listened attentively, occasionally nodding.
Her respectful attention seemed to fuel Marcus's confidence. He began sharing stories of training exercises and deployment experiences, each tale designed to illustrate the vast difference between military combat training and civilian martial arts. The thing is, Marcus continued, warming to his theme, when someone's really trying to kill you, all these fancy techniques go out the window. It comes down to who's tougher, who's trained harder, who's been tested in real situations. That's why military hand-to-hand combat is so much more effective than what you see in competitions like this. You've obviously had experiences I could never imagine, Elena said quietly. But, I think every type of training has something valuable to offer. Her humility only reinforced Marcus's belief in his superior experience.
Don't get me wrong, what you're doing is impressive for civilian competition.
But, there's just no comparison to military training. We learn to fight dirty, to use whatever's available, to keep going when our bodies want to quit. Jake had been listening to the conversation with growing discomfort. He knew Marcus well enough to recognize where this was heading, and something about Elena's quiet demeanor suggested there was more to her than met the eye. Marcus, maybe we should let her get back to preparing for her next match. But Marcus was too caught up in his lecture to take the hint. Actually, I was thinking it might be educational to demonstrate some real combat techniques. Show the difference between sport fighting and the real thing. He turned to Elena with what he probably thought was a charming smile. Would you be interested in a little friendly sparring? Nothing serious, just a chance to see how sport techniques hold up against military training. The request hung in the air for a moment. Around them, other competitors and spectators had begun to notice the conversation, drawn by Marcus's loud voice and confident posture. Elena looked down at her hands, seeming to consider the proposal carefully. I don't know, she said finally. I wouldn't want to waste your time. You're clearly much more experienced than me. Come on, Marcus pressed. It would be educational for both of us. I could show you some techniques that aren't allowed in competition. And, who knows? Maybe you could teach me something too. Elena looked around at the growing crowd of onlookers, then, back at Marcus. Something shifted in her expression, though it was so subtle that only the most observant would have noticed. If you really think it would be helpful, she said slowly, I suppose we could try a few things. Marcus grinned. Excellent. Don't worry, I'll go easy on you. Just want to demonstrate some concepts. As they moved toward an empty mat, Jake caught Elena's eye. For just a moment, he saw something there that made him deeply uncomfortable. It wasn't fear or uncertainty. It was the look of someone who had made a difficult decision and was preparing for the consequences. Marcus, Jake called out, trying one last time to derail what was about to happen. Maybe this isn't such a good idea. She's got a championship match coming up. But Marcus waved him off. It'll just take a few minutes. Besides, this could be good preparation for her. Show her what it's like to face someone with real combat experience. Elena began stretching, her movements slow and deliberate. As she prepared, she spoke quietly, almost to herself. My grandfather used to tell me something, she said, her voice barely audible above the crowd noise. He said that the most dangerous thing you can do is underestimate your opponent. That pride comes before the fall. Marcus, busy rolling his shoulders and cracking his knuckles, didn't really hear her words. What was that? Elena straightened up, and, for the first time since their conversation began, she looked directly into his eyes.
I said, remember who I am. Marcus laughed. Elena Rodriguez, right? Don't worry, I'll remember. But, Elena shook her head slightly.
No, she said, her voice still quiet but somehow carrying more weight than before.
Remember who I really am.
There was something in her tone that should have warned him, something in the way she carried herself that should have made him reconsider. But Marcus was too confident, too certain of his superiority, to pay attention to such subtle cues. As they faced each other on the mat, surrounded by a crowd that had grown larger as word spread of the impromptu match between the Navy SEAL and the small woman who had been dominating the tournament, Elena took a deep breath. She had tried to avoid this moment, had attempted to deflect his challenge with humility and deference. But some people, she knew from long experience, only learn through demonstration. The gymnasium fell quiet as the two fighters prepared to engage. In that moment of silence, Elena Rodriguez closed her eyes briefly and allowed herself to remember who she really was beneath the humble exterior she had cultivated for civilian life. Marcus took his stance, confident and aggressive, ready to teach this civilian fighter a lesson about real combat. He had no way of knowing that he was about to receive an education himself, one that would shatter his assumptions about strength, skill, and the true meaning of being a warrior. The match was about to begin, and everything Marcus thought he knew about fighting was about to be proven devastatingly wrong. The two fighters circled each other slowly, the tension in the gymnasium palpable as spectators pressed closer to get a better view. Marcus moved with the aggressive confidence of someone who had never doubted his physical dominance, his stance wide and powerful, hands ready to grab or strike. Elena, by contrast, seemed almost to float across the mat, her movements so light and fluid that she appeared to barely touch the ground. Whenever you're ready, Marcus said, his voice loud enough for the crowd to hear.
I'll let you make the first move. Elena nodded almost imperceptibly.
That's very kind of you, she replied, but there was something different in her voice now, a subtle change that Jake noticed even if Marcus didn't. The deference was still there, but underneath it was something else entirely. Marcus fainted forward, testing her reaction, expecting to see the nervous flinch of someone out of her depth. Instead, Elena simply shifted slightly, her position adjusting in a way that seemed casual but left Marcus with the uncomfortable feeling that he had somehow moved into a disadvantageous position without realizing it. He shook off the feeling and pressed forward more aggressively, reaching out to grab her shoulder in what should have been an overwhelming display of his size and strength advantage. His hand closed on empty air. Elena had moved, but so smoothly and naturally that Marcus couldn't even say exactly how she had avoided his grasp. The crowd murmured appreciatively, recognizing skill even if they couldn't fully understand what they were seeing. Marcus frowned, his confidence flickering for just a moment before reasserting itself.
Nice dodge, he said. But you can't run forever.
I'm not running, Elena said quietly.
I'm just trying to understand what you want to show me. Marcus decided to end the demonstration quickly.
He launched a series of attacks that showcased his military training, powerful strikes and grappling attempts that should have overwhelmed any civilian fighter. Each movement was precise and devastating, the kind of technique that had served him well in actual combat situations.
None of them touched Elena.
She moved like smoke, like water, like something that existed in the spaces between Marcus's attacks. Every strike passed harmlessly by, every grab attempt met nothing but air. She didn't seem to be working hard or breathing heavily. If anything, she appeared to be studying him, learning from each attack he made. The crowd had grown completely silent now, watching something that defied their understanding of physics and combat. Marcus was a trained killer, a man whose hands had ended lives in service of his country, and he couldn't even touch a woman who looked like she might blow away in a strong wind.
Frustration began to creep into Marcus's movements.
He increased the intensity of his attacks, abandoning some of the control he had promised to maintain. These were techniques designed to incapacitate quickly and permanently, the kind of moves that had no place in a friendly demonstration. Elena continued to avoid them all, but now she began to do something that chilled Jake to the bone. She started talking, her voice conversational and calm despite the deadly dance taking place on the mat. "You're very strong," she said as one of Marcus's punches whistled past her ear.
Your technique is quite good too. I can see you've had excellent training.
Marcus, breathing hard now from the exertion of his failed attacks, tried to respond but found himself winded. Elena, meanwhile, appeared to be having a casual conversation while simultaneously making him look foolish. The military training shows, she continued, slipping under a grab attempt that should have been impossible to avoid. Very practical, very efficient. Designed to end fights quickly in life or death situations.
Marcus managed to gasp out, "What are you?"
Elena paused her movement for just a moment, and, in that instant of stillness, Marcus finally saw her clearly. Gone was the humble, apologetic woman who had deferred to his experience and expertise. In her place stood someone else entirely, someone whose eyes held depths of knowledge and experience that made his 20 years of training seem like a weekend hobby. "I'm someone who learned a very long time ago that the most dangerous opponents are often the ones who don't look dangerous," Elena said.
"My grandfather taught me that lesson when I was very young."
She moved then, not away from Marcus but toward him, and, for the first time in the encounter, she initiated contact. Her hand touched his wrist so lightly that it shouldn't have affected his balance or posture at all. Instead, Marcus found himself stumbling forward, completely off balance, his own momentum working against him in ways that seemed to violate everything he knew about physics. Before he could recover, Elena was behind him, her small hand pressing against a specific point on his back. Marcus felt his legs give way, not from pain or injury, but as if his nervous system had simply forgotten how to keep him upright. He crashed to the mat, unhurt but completely bewildered. "That's a pressure point technique," Elena explained to the stunned crowd as Marcus struggled to understand what had happened to him. "It temporarily disrupts the nerve signals that control balance and coordination. Completely harmless, but very effective." Marcus rolled over and looked up at her, his face red with embarrassment and growing anger. "What kind of parlor trick was that?"
Elena's expression softened, and, for a moment, the humble woman returned.
"It's not a trick," she said gently.
"It's just a different kind of training. Would you like to continue?" Pride and humiliation warred within Marcus as he climbed to his feet.
Every instinct told him to walk away, to end this demonstration that was quickly becoming a public embarrassment. But his ego wouldn't allow it. Too many people were watching. Too many of his fellow SEALs had seen him taken down by someone who looked like she should be teaching kindergarten rather than fighting. "Yeah," he said, his voice tight with suppressed rage.
"Let's continue."
This time, Marcus abandoned all pretense of a friendly demonstration. He attacked with the full fury and skill of someone trained to kill, using techniques that were forbidden in any sporting venue. He went for nerve strikes and joint breaks, attacks designed to maim or incapacitate permanently.
Elena's response was to become even more elusive, even more impossible to touch.
She moved through his attacks like a ghost, always one step ahead, always just out of reach.
But now she began to do something else that demonstrated the vast gulf between their skill levels.
She began to explain her movements as she made them. "When you throw that punch, you shift your weight to your front foot," she said as Marcus launched a devastating hook that should have taken her head off. She wasn't there when it arrived.
"That creates an opening on your left side for about half a second."
As if to prove her point, her hand flicked out and touched his ribs exactly where she had indicated. The touch was light, almost gentle, but it demonstrated that she could have struck with devastating force if she had chosen to. "Your military training emphasizes speed and power," she continued, avoiding a knee strike that could have shattered ribs. "But it doesn't account for an opponent who doesn't fight where you expect them to be." Marcus was breathing heavily now, sweat pouring down his face as he realized that nothing in his extensive combat training had prepared him for an opponent like this. He wasn't just being beaten, he was being taught, analyzed, and dissected in front of a crowd of spectators who were witnessing the complete dismantling of everything he thought he knew about fighting. "Who are you really?" he gasped between attacks, his voice carrying a note of desperation that hadn't been there before. Elena caught his wrist as he threw another punch, her grip somehow gentle and irresistible at the same time. "I tried to tell you," she said, her voice filled with something that might have been regret. "My grandfather used to say that a true warrior hides their strength behind humility, because the greatest victories are the ones where no one gets hurt." She released his wrist and stepped back, giving him space to recover. He also said that sometimes people need to be reminded that strength comes in many forms. Marcus stood there, swaying slightly from exhaustion and confusion, staring at this small woman who had just demonstrated abilities that shouldn't exist outside of fantasy movies. The crowd around them was completely silent, as if they too were trying to process what they had witnessed.
I don't understand, Marcus said finally. What kind of training could possibly?
The kind that takes a lifetime to master, Elena replied.
The kind that my family has been perfecting for generations.
The kind that teaches you that the greatest strength is knowing when not to use your power. She looked around at the watching crowd, then, back at Marcus. I compete in tournaments like this because I love the art, the discipline, the constant opportunity to learn and improve. But, this isn't what I trained for originally. Marcus wiped sweat from his eyes, trying to focus on her words through his exhaustion and bewilderment. What did you train for?
Elena was quiet for a long moment, as if deciding how much to reveal.
When she spoke again, her voice was so soft that only those closest to the mat could hear her. My grandfather was Roberto Rodriguez, she said simply. The name meant nothing to most of the spectators, but Jake's sharp intake of breath suggested he recognized it. Marcus looked confused, clearly unaware of the significance. He was a legend in certain circles, Elena continued. A man who taught defensive arts to people who needed to protect themselves and others. Government officials, diplomats, people whose lives were constantly in danger. He believed that the most effective protection came not from aggression, but from the ability to neutralize threats without causing permanent harm. She gestured toward Marcus, who was slowly beginning to understand the magnitude of what had just happened. Everything I just showed you, every technique that kept me safe from your attacks, was designed not to hurt you but to protect myself without escalating the situation. Marcus felt the weight of realization settling over him like a heavy blanket. You could have hurt me, he said, the words coming out as more of a statement than a question.
Elena nodded sadly.
I could have ended this encounter in the first few seconds, she admitted.
But that's not what my grandfather would have wanted. He taught me that true strength lies in choosing not to use your full capabilities unless absolutely necessary.
The implications of her words hung in the air between them. Marcus began to understand that he had not just been outfought, he had been shown mercy by someone whose abilities so far exceeded his own that the comparison was almost laughable. Why didn't you tell me who you were from the beginning? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper.
Elena's expression grew even sadder.
Because I hoped I wouldn't need to, she said. I hoped that humility and respect might be enough to avoid this demonstration altogether.
Sometimes the best fights are the ones that never happen.
Marcus looked around at the crowd of spectators, at his fellow SEALs who were staring at him with expressions ranging from amazement to pity, at the woman who had just taught him the hardest lesson of his military career. Remember who I am, she had said.
Now he did.
The silence in the gymnasium stretched on for what felt like hours but was probably only seconds. Marcus stood in the center of the mat, his chest heaving from exertion, his mind struggling to process what had just occurred. Around him, spectators began to whisper among themselves, trying to make sense of the one-sided encounter they had just witnessed. Elena remained where she was, her posture relaxed but alert, watching Marcus with eyes that seemed far older than her apparent age. There was no triumph in her expression, no satisfaction at having demonstrated her superiority. If anything, she looked saddened by the necessity of the lesson she had just delivered. Jake stepped forward from the crowd of SEALs, his face pale as he approached his teammate. Marcus, he said quietly, I think we should go.
But Marcus didn't move.
He was staring at Elena as if seeing her for the first time, trying to reconcile the humble woman who had spoken so respectfully to him earlier with the deadly artist who had just made him look like an untrained amateur. Roberto Rodriguez, Marcus said slowly, the name finally clicking in his memory.
The ghost of Guatemala.
The man who single-handedly extracted 3 kidnapped ambassadors from a cartel stronghold without firing a shot.
Elena nodded slightly. Among other things, yes.
Though he always said the stories got exaggerated in the telling. Marcus felt his knees go weak as the full implications hit him.
Roberto Rodriguez wasn't just a legend in certain military circles, he was a myth, a figure whose exploits seemed too extraordinary to be real.
Stories of a man who could walk through enemy territory like he was invisible, who could incapacitate trained killers without making a sound, who taught defensive arts so advanced that governments paid fortunes just for consultations.
And you're his. Marcus began. Granddaughter, Elena finished.
He raised me from the time I was 7 years old, after my parents died in a car accident.
Everything I know, he taught me.
The crowd around them had grown larger as word spread throughout the gymnasium. Other competitors, coaches, and spectators pressed closer, drawn by the unusual nature of the demonstration and the growing reputation of the small woman who seemed to possess supernatural abilities. Marcus looked around at all the watching faces, then back at Elena. "I need to understand," he said, his voice hoarse.
"What you just did to me, is that even possible? I mean, I've been training my whole adult life. I've been in real combat situations. How did you make it look so easy?" Elena considered the question carefully before answering.
"It wasn't easy," she said finally. "What you saw was the result of more than 20 years of training, starting when I was barely old enough to walk.
My grandfather began teaching me not fighting techniques, but awareness.
How to read people, how to understand movement and balance, how to see the spaces between actions where safety exists." She gestured toward the empty mat around them. "By the time I was 12, I could predict what an opponent would do 3 moves before they did it. By 15, I understood the human body so well that I could disrupt its functions with precise pressure point manipulation. The fighting techniques came last, and only because my grandfather insisted I needed to be able to protect others as well as myself." Marcus shook his head in disbelief.
"But I've been training since I was 18. 2 decades of military combat instruction, real-world experience."
"And that training has served you well in the situations it was designed for," Elena interrupted gently. "But it was designed for a different kind of conflict. Military combat training teaches you to be aggressive, to overwhelm opponents with superior firepower and tactics. What my grandfather taught me was designed for situations where aggression would only make things worse." She paused, seeming to choose her words carefully. "He used to say that the military teaches you to be a hammer, which is perfect when everything you face is a nail. But
what happens when you encounter something that isn't a nail? Something that requires a different kind of tool entirely?"
Jake had been listening intently to the conversation, his analytical mind trying to process the implications of what he was hearing. "The stories about your grandfather," he said to Elena, "they said he could walk into any situation and defuse it without violence. That he never killed anyone in 30 years of operations."
Elena's expression softened with affection.
"He was very proud of that record. He used to say that anyone could end a life, but it took real skill to preserve one while still accomplishing the mission."
"But how?"
Marcus asked, frustration evident in his voice.
"How do you neutralize threats without using violence?"
Elena smiled for the first time since their encounter began.
"Who says I didn't use violence? Everything I just did to you was violent.
I controlled your movement, disrupted your balance, manipulated your nervous system, and demonstrated that I could have seriously injured you at any point. The difference is that I used precisely the amount of violence necessary to achieve my goal, no more and no less." She moved to a nearby water bottle and took a small sip before continuing.
"Most people think of violence as binary, either you're fighting or you're not. But violence exists on a spectrum.
What my grandfather taught me was to calibrate my response exactly to the threat level I faced.
Against you, I needed to demonstrate capability while ensuring you remained unharmed.
In other situations, the calculus might be very different." Marcus was beginning to understand, but the knowledge was humbling in a way that cut to his core.
"You weren't even trying to hurt me."
"Of course not,"
Elena said, looking genuinely surprised by the statement. "Why would I want to hurt you?"
"You weren't trying to hurt me either, not really. You wanted to prove a point about military training versus civilian martial arts.
Once I understood that, it became a matter of educating rather than defeating."
The distinction seemed to matter enormously to her, and Marcus began to see how different their fundamental approaches to conflict really were. His training had taught him to identify enemies and eliminate them as efficiently as possible. Hers had taught her to identify the minimum force necessary to achieve safety and apply exactly that much and no more.
What if I had been trying to hurt you? Marcus asked. What if this had been a real threat situation? Elena's expression grew serious.
Then, we would have had a very different conversation, and it would have ended much more quickly. The understated way she delivered the statement sent a chill through Marcus. There was no boasting in her voice, no attempt to intimidate. She was simply stating a fact, and somehow that made it more terrifying than any threat could have been.
Jake cleared his throat nervously. Elena, I have to ask, are there others like you? Other people with your grandfather's training? Elena shook her head. Not many.
My grandfather was very selective about who he taught, and most of his students learned only specific techniques for specific situations. I'm one of the few who learned the complete system, and probably the only one who's continued developing it since his death 5 years ago.
The revelation that Roberto Rodriguez was dead hit Marcus like a physical blow. Somehow, knowing that the legendary figure was gone made Elena's abilities seem even more remarkable.
She wasn't just carrying on a tradition, she was its last practitioner.
So why are you here? Marcus asked. Why compete in civilian tournaments when you could? Could what? Elena interrupted. Work for governments? Train military units? Accept lucrative contracts from private security firms?
Her tone suggested she had considered and rejected all of these options. My grandfather spent most of his life helping people who had no other options. Diplomats whose lives were threatened, families whose children had been kidnapped, communities terrorized by groups too powerful for local law enforcement to handle. He never worked for money, only for the chance to make the world a little safer. She looked around the gymnasium, taking in the crowd of competitors and spectators who had gathered to watch their unusual demonstration. These tournaments keep me sharp, give me opportunities to test my skills against different fighting styles. But, more importantly, they let me be normal for a while. Just another competitor trying to win matches and improve her techniques. Marcus felt a stab of guilt as he realized what he had taken away from her. His arrogance and insistence on demonstrating his superiority had forced her to reveal abilities she clearly preferred to keep hidden. The humble woman who had competed quietly all day was gone, replaced by someone whose reputation would now precede her wherever she went. I'm sorry, he said quietly.
I ruined your anonymity, didn't I? Elena shrugged philosophically. It was bound to happen eventually. My grandfather always said that true skill can't stay hidden forever. Someone would have pushed hard enough to force me to show more than I wanted to. She looked at him with something that might have been sympathy. The question now is what we both do with what happened here today. Marcus wasn't sure what she meant, but before he could ask for clarification, a commotion near the entrance to the gymnasium caught everyone's attention. A group of men in expensive suits had entered the venue, moving with the purposeful stride of people accustomed to getting their way. They scanned the crowd until their eyes settled on Elena, then began walking directly toward her. Elena's entire demeanor changed the moment she saw them. The relaxed, almost casual posture she had maintained throughout her encounter with Marcus was replaced by attention so subtle that only someone watching carefully would have noticed it. But her eyes never left the approaching men, and Marcus got the distinct impression that she was rapidly calculating distances, escape routes, and potential weapons. Friends of yours? Jake asked quietly. Elena shook her head slowly. No, she said, her voice barely audible. Definitely not friends. The lead man, distinguished-looking with silver hair and cold eyes, reached the edge of the mat and stopped. He looked from Elena to Marcus and back again, his expression revealing nothing of his thoughts or intentions. Ms. Rodriguez, he said, his accent suggesting Eastern European origins. We need to talk. Elena remained perfectly still, but Marcus could feel the sudden increase in tension radiating from her small frame. When she spoke, her voice carried a note he hadn't heard before, not fear, exactly, but a wariness that suggested these men represented something far more dangerous than a curious government official or potential employer. I don't think we have anything to discuss, Elena said carefully.
The man smiled, but there was no warmth in the expression.
Oh, but I think we do.
You see, we've been looking for you for quite some time, ever since your grandfather's unfortunate passing.
There are certain obligations that he left unfulfilled.
Marcus felt a chill run down his spine as he realized that their impromptu demonstration had attracted far more attention than either of them had intended. By forcing Elena to reveal her abilities so publicly, he had inadvertently painted a target on her back that might have deadly consequences.
Elena's warning echoed in his memory, "Remember who I am."
Now, as dangerous men with unclear intentions closed in around them, Marcus finally understood that knowing who Elena really was might be the most important knowledge he had ever gained. The question was whether that knowledge would be enough to help her deal with whatever was coming next. The gymnasium's atmosphere shifted dramatically as the suited men formed a loose circle around Elena and Marcus. Conversations throughout the venue began to die down as people sensed the tension emanating from the group near the competition mats. What had moments before been a place of athletic celebration now felt like the calm before a dangerous storm. Elena stood perfectly still, her eyes moving from one man to another as she assessed the threat they represented. Marcus counted 6 of them, all carrying themselves with the predatory grace of trained killers. Their expensive clothing couldn't hide the bulges of concealed weapons or the way they positioned themselves to control exit routes and sightlines. "You know," Elena said conversationally, her voice carrying to the nearest spectators, "my grandfather always taught me that the most dangerous conversations are the ones that start with someone saying we need to talk." The silver-haired leader smiled again, the expression no warmer than before. "Your grandfather was a wise man. It's unfortunate that his wisdom didn't extend to honoring his commitments." "My grandfather honored every commitment he ever made," Elena replied, her tone sharpening slightly. "If you think otherwise, then, perhaps you misunderstood the nature of your agreement with him." Marcus felt completely out of his depth. The conversation was clearly about something far more complex than a simple business dispute, but the underlying currents of menace were unmistakable. He glanced toward Jake and the other SEALs, seeing his own confusion and growing alarm reflected in their faces. The leader took a step closer to Elena, his movement causing her to shift almost imperceptibly into a more balanced stance. "The agreement was quite specific, Ms. Rodriguez. Your grandfather accepted payment for certain services that were never delivered due to his untimely death. The debt passes to his heir." "I inherited my grandfather's knowledge," Elena said quietly, "not his business obligations."
"I'm afraid the distinction is not one we recognize," the man replied.
"You have skills that were promised to us.
Skills that we have already paid for. We simply want what we purchased."
Marcus began to understand the situation, and the knowledge filled him with dread. These men weren't government officials or potential employers. They were clients of Roberto Rodriguez, people who had contracted for his unique services and now wanted Elena to fulfill agreements made before her grandfather's death. Elena seemed to reach the same conclusion Marcus had, because her posture shifted again. She was no longer simply alert, she was preparing for action.
"What exactly do you think my grandfather promised you?"
The leader's smile widened.
"A consultation, shall we say?"
"Certain individuals in our organization require neutralization, but the political ramifications of direct action would be problematic. Your grandfather's reputation for resolving such matters without creating international incidents was exactly what we needed." The euphemistic language couldn't disguise the reality of what was being discussed. These men wanted Elena to kill people, and they believed her grandfather had already agreed to do so before his death.
"My grandfather never worked as an assassin," Elena said firmly.
"His techniques were defensive, designed to protect people, not eliminate them." Perhaps, the leader conceded. But the same skills that allow one to neutralize threats without detection could easily be adapted for more permanent solutions.
"We're not unreasonable people, Ms. Rodriguez.
We're prepared to offer additional compensation for your cooperation."
Elena shook her head slowly. "There isn't enough money in the world to make me do what you're asking."
The pleasant facade finally slipped from the leader's face, revealing something cold and predatory underneath. "Money was our first offer."
"It doesn't have to be our only offer."
The threat hung in the air like smoke, poisoning the atmosphere around them. Marcus felt his military training kick in, his body automatically shifting into combat readiness despite his recent humbling experience. Whatever these men represented, whatever they wanted from Elena, he couldn't stand by and watch them threaten her. Maybe we should take this conversation somewhere more private, the leader suggested, his tone making it clear that this wasn't really a suggestion. Elena looked around the gymnasium, taking in the crowd of spectators who were beginning to realize that something serious was happening. Children were present, families who had come to watch the competition. Whatever was about to happen, she couldn't let it endanger innocent people. "You're right," she said finally. "This isn't the place for this discussion." Relief flickered across the leader's face, quickly replaced by satisfaction. "I'm glad you're being reasonable." "Oh, I'm being very reasonable," Elena replied, and something in her tone made Marcus's hair stand on end. "I'm giving you one chance to walk away from this. To leave this place and never come looking for me again." The leader laughed, the sound harsh and mocking. "You're hardly in a position to make demands, young lady. You're outnumbered 6-1, and we're not sport fighters bound by rules and regulations." Elena's expression grew sad, the way it had when she had been forced to demonstrate her abilities to Marcus. "You're right about one thing," she said quietly. "You're not bound by rules and regulations. Neither am I." The change that came over her was subtle but unmistakable. The humble tournament competitor disappeared entirely, replaced by someone whose very presence seemed to alter the air pressure in the gymnasium. Marcus had thought he understood what Elena was capable of after their encounter on the mat, but he realized now that she had shown him only the gentlest fraction of her true abilities. "Last warning," Elena said, her voice carrying a weight of authority that seemed to press down on everyone within hearing distance. "Leave. Now." The leader's hand moved toward the inside of his jacket, a motion that would have been invisible to most observers. Elena saw it, of course. She saw everything. What happened next would be talked about in hushed tones for years afterward by those who witnessed it. Elena moved, and the six-armed men who had seemed so threatening moments before simply stopped. Marcus blinked, trying to process what his eyes had just shown him. Elena had crossed the distance between herself and the nearest gunman in what seemed like a single fluid motion. Her hand had touched his wrist for perhaps a tenth of a second, and now the man was standing frozen, his partially drawn weapon trapped in his jacket as if his hand had forgotten how to function. Before Marcus could even begin to understand how that was possible, Elena was already moving to the next man. Each encounter lasted only an instant, each touch so light and brief that it looked more like a greeting than an attack. But, with each contact, another dangerous man became as harmless as a statue. The leader found himself the last one standing, his men arrayed around him in various poses of incomplete action, their bodies refusing to obey their minds' increasingly frantic commands. Elena stood before him, close enough to touch but making no move to do so. "Pressure point paralysis," she explained conversationally, as if she were discussing the weather. "Temporary disruption of nerve function. They'll recover in about 20 minutes with no permanent damage." The leader stared at her in horror, finally, understanding that he was facing something far beyond his experience or preparation. "What are you?" he whispered. Elena tilted her head slightly, considering the question. "I'm my grandfather's granddaughter," she said simply. "I'm someone who learned from the best teacher in the world that there's always a way to solve problems without unnecessary violence." She gestured toward his immobilized men. "These gentlemen will be fine. Their weapons are secure, their ability to cause harm temporarily neutralized, and no one has been seriously injured. This is what my grandfather would call an elegant solution." The leader looked around wildly, as if expecting reinforcements to appear and rescue him from this nightmare scenario. When none materialized, his shoulders slumped in defeat. "What do you want?" he asked. Elena's expression grew serious. "I want you to understand that my grandfather's business died with him. Whatever arrangements you think you had with him, whatever services you believe you purchased, the contract is void. I don't work for people like you, and I never will." "And if we come back?" the leader asked, though his voice suggested he already knew the answer.
Elena's smile was gentle but somehow more terrifying than any threat could have been.
Then, you'll discover that what you just experienced was me being merciful. I won't make the same mistake twice. The leader nodded slowly, understanding flooding his face. He had come here expecting to intimidate a young woman into compliance, possibly through threats of violence if necessary. Instead, he had encountered someone whose capabilities so far exceeded his own that resistance was not just futile but potentially suicidal. "We'll go," he said quietly.
"Yes," Elena agreed.
"You will. And you'll make sure that anyone else who might have similar ideas understands that Roberto Rodriguez's heir is not available for the kind of work they have in mind."
As if responding to some invisible signal, the paralyzed men began to show signs of recovery.
Fingers twitched, breathing deepened, and awareness slowly returned to their eyes. Elena stepped back, giving them space to process what had happened to them. Marcus watched in amazement as 6 trained killers struggled to understand how they had been neutralized so completely and so quickly. The looks on their faces suggested that they were questioning everything they thought they knew about combat and personal security.
"Go," Elena said simply, and they went.
The leader helped his still unsteady men toward the gymnasium exit, casting one last look back at Elena as they reached the doors. She met his gaze steadily, and whatever he saw there convinced him that pursuing this matter further would be the last mistake he ever made. When the doors closed behind them, the gymnasium erupted in excited chatter as spectators tried to make sense of what they had just witnessed. Elena stood in the center of it all, looking suddenly exhausted by the necessity of what she had just done. Marcus approached her carefully, still processing everything he had seen and learned.
"Are you okay?"
Elena nodded, but her expression remained troubled.
"My grandfather spent his entire career trying to help people solve their problems without violence.
It breaks my heart that there are people who only understood one lesson from his reputation, that he was dangerous when cornered." "They won't come back," Marcus said with certainty.
"After what you just showed them, they wouldn't dare." Elena sighed.
"They won't come back," she agreed.
"But others might.
Word will spread about what happened here today, about what I'm capable of.
My anonymity is gone forever."
Marcus felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. His arrogance and insistence on a public demonstration had set in motion a chain of events that would change Elena's life forever. "I'm sorry," he said quietly.
"This is my fault."
Elena looked at him for a long moment, then smiled with genuine warmth for the first time since the suited men had arrived.
"No," she said. "This was inevitable. My grandfather always said that you can't hide exceptional abilities forever. Someone would have pushed hard enough to force me to reveal them eventually."
She looked around the gymnasium one last time, taking in the competition mats where she had spent the day quietly perfecting her art, the crowds of spectators who now saw her as something far more than a skilled martial artist. "Besides," she said, her smile widening, "maybe it's time for Roberto Rodriguez's legacy to continue in the open. There are a lot of people in this world who need protection, and not all threats can be handled by traditional security measures." Marcus felt something shift in his understanding of strength, of capability, of what it truly meant to be a warrior.
"What will you do now?"
Elena shouldered her gym bag and walked toward the exit, her movements once again those of an ordinary woman leaving an ordinary tournament. But Marcus would never again see her as ordinary. "Now," she said over her shoulder, "I'll remember who I am." As she disappeared into the crowd outside the gymnasium, Marcus realized that he would carry the lessons of this day for the rest of his life. He had learned humility, respect, and the difference between violence and force. Most importantly, he had learned that the most dangerous people in the world are often the ones who look the least dangerous. Elena Rodriguez had warned him to remember who she was.
He never forgot.